So we've all got a variety of different versions of what our human rights are. But that's great, and that's the way it should be, because if we all tried to fix everything, we'd be spread too thin. So what we're going to do now is find out and figure out what our motivations are and where we need to put our effort and everything that we can do in our energy to support the development of protecting human rights. So human rights, from the Cambridge Dictionary: the basic rights that it's generally considered all people should have, such as justice and the freedom to say what you think. And the word I'm going to highlight here, which is the word where most human rights get violated, is the word all. So a lot of people do have their human rights. And, so sometimes we get them like scratched out a little bit, or we feel like, oh, that's not quite fair. But we generally, quite a lot of people have human rights that are protected. But unfortunately, the issue is that that's the issue. Is it's the general. It's just it's most. And we need to make sure it's for all people, because when one group is isolated, that's not really fair, and it kind of marginalizing other groups makes someone else powerful usually. So that's what we've got to try and avoid. Make sure we're helping everyone and not just a certain group that usually we can fit into. Where does human rights come from? Well, there's a lot of different places. Human rights has obviously always existed, but it exists in a more official sense from the UN. So the UN's Universal Declaration of Human Rights, established in 1948, and it outlines everyone's basic human rights. Everyone's, that word again. There are 30 articles in this, so there are 30 different rights that everyone needs to be adhering to, and the UN will control otherwise. I've pulled out 3 that I think are quite important to us here. So the first one is everyone accused of a crime has the right for a fair and public trial. Everything is on a spectrum. Things happen for different reasons. There's different punishments that will suit different crimes. And that's why we need to make sure these fair trials and these public trials, which means that we are able to, as members of the public, allow judgment on the criminal justice system and make sure it's being maintained fairly. The next one here is we all have the right to live in freedom and in safety. I mean, it's obvious, it's something that everyone would expect to have, but sadly, it's a lot of people don't have. And in the UK, we think this, we often think human rights only apply overseas. No, if you think about marginalised groups, rights to safety are often challenged on a daily basis. And then finally, no one has the right to inflict torture on another. And obviously, torture is a word that you can look at here as what it could be. It could be mental torture. It could be your living conditions. It could be the working conditions that you have. So really think about, no one has this right to inflict anything horrible on you.
Black or Black British women make up 8.8% of female prisoners, compared to 3.3% of the general population. So we can already see that is an over-representation of Black women in the criminal justice system and in prison. The Ministry of Justice analysis shows us that Black women are about 25% more likely than white women to be sentenced to custody at Crown Court. So for an example, for every 100 white women sentenced to custody at the Crown Court for drug offences, it was 227 for Black women, and they received custodial sentences. BAME, so Black and minority ethnic women, are more likely to experience isolation when in prison, and this leads to increased levels of depression, whilst at the same time they may be less likely to seek help from healthcare staff. So just quickly, why am I talking specifically about Black women? Well, Black women have complex backgrounds. They experience domestic violence, poverty, mental health concerns, and substance abuse. And it can be said that because Black women are at the margins of race, gender, and class, it leads to disadvantage and inequality. There's not been much literature on Black women. When we've looked at race, it's focused more on Black men and BAME men, so Muslim men, for example, when we're looking at Stop and Search. And where previous literature sort of focused on gender, it's either focused on women as a homogenous group, failing to sort of differentiate the needs and experiences of Black women, or it focuses on white women. So because of this, Black women have been rendered invisible within literature. And a quick example of this is Ross Burnett's study on race relations in prison. So out of the 501 prisoners that he interviewed, only 29 were women, and an even smaller number of these participants were Black women. So despite this, when presenting the findings, that they talked about Black prisoners' experiences as a whole, rather than differentiating between BAME women and men. An analogy that a scholar called Kimberly Crenshaw came up with in terms of intersectionality, and she tried to use it to describe the way that Black women face discrimination. So she talks about how a car accident at a crossroads could be caused by a car from many different angles. And not only that, but it could be the fault of more than one car. So it could be two cars that have caused that particular accident. So just as race and gender can cause discrimination mutually sort of at the same time, that's the point that she was trying to get across, that it's not just one thing that causes this discrimination, it could be a combination of things.
So when I talk about LGBT human rights, then, well, what am I referring to? Well, I'm referring to a number of specific things. So I'm referring to, LGBTQ people's right to live and work freely. So whether it's things such as going to work, serving in the military, staying in a hotel, accessing healthcare or another service. It's about making sure that we are protected from discrimination. So we're able to work wherever we want and be who we are. We're able to serve in the military. We're able to, access services without being discriminated against or turned away. It's about LGBTQ people's right to love. So it's about how their ability to start a family, to get married, and to share their lives with the people that they love. It's about LGBTQ people's right to be who they are and to live freely. It's about their right to be safe. All people should be free to walk down the street without fear of abuse, hate, or violence. People should be free to hold their partner's hand without fear, and they should be free from bullying at work and at school. More broadly, though, it's also about making sure that everyone everywhere is accepted without any exception. So homophobic, biphobic and transphobic hate crimes are crimes which are motivated by an offender's hostility or prejudice towards lesbian women, gay men, bisexual men and women, or trans people. And over the last 5 years, we've seen significant increases in the rates of hate crime towards LGBTQ communities. So let me take homophobic hate crimes to start with. So in the last 5 years, homophobic hate crimes reported to the police have trebled from around 6,500 in 2015 to around 18,500 in 2020. And from last year to this year, we've alone seen an increase of 20%. It doesn't only exclusively occur in the physical world, and that the establishment of the internet and how that has grown over the last few years, particularly social media, has meant that has provided a new arena or a new platform in which LGBTQ plus people can be abused. So much so is the problem of LGBTQ abuse online is that it's been described as endemic, and the internet has been labelled as unsafe and as a vehicle for abuse and hate directed at LGBTQ communities. So despite the progress we have made, as I hope my short lecture has demonstrated, many, many issues still remain, and many LGBTQ people aren't able to live their lives freely. They do not feel safe, and they fear constant discrimination. It is therefore vital that we tackle homophobic, biphobic and transphobic hate crime in order to ensure that LGBTQ people can live their lives happily and freely. So I hope that's given you some stuff to think about. Thank you very much for listening.
Today is the 10th of December, International Human Rights Day, and the theme for the International Human Rights Day this year is actually Recover Better, by ensuring that human rights are central to recovery efforts. Human rights defenders generally, both men and women, have been proven that they've been the backbone for societies in responding to COVID-19. Women human rights defenders particularly have been in front line. They've been playing an important role in the heart of their communities. They've been from providing accurate information, supporting marginalized groups and ensuring that they can access healthcare, advocating for those discriminated against, and delivering humanitarian aid, also combating hate speech and discrimination, inequality, which has been exposed by the COVID-19 crisis. We have seen that human rights defenders around the world even before COVID-19, have been under attack. And women human rights defenders have been also facing additional challenges and threats based on their gender. Historically, we have seen human rights violations committed in the name of responding to public health, such as this pandemic. So there is no really justification for any human rights violations. There is no place. There is no place for any human rights violations in the context of emergency. Here is a case of 3 women from Iran who were actually protesting against the forced veil in Iran, and they've been together, being given 42 years in prison for promoting unveiling. We have here Lujine El Hazloul. She is one of the human rights defenders. She is right now still in jail. She and the 13 other women human rights defenders being jailed for defending women's rights. They are the ones who have been calling for women's rights to drive a car, and they are now in jail. Even though women in Saudi Arabia have been given the rights to drive a car, but they are actually being in jail now, not for driving cars, but for driving change for human rights. Another campaign is also for Nasima Al-Sada. She's one of those women human rights defenders who have been campaigning for women's rights to drive a car, and also to end the guardian mailship against women. But she's still facing also ill treatment in prison, and we are campaigning for her right now. So please do come enter Amnesty website and take action in the website.
A question for Luke from Sally. Do you think that social media has a positive effect on LGBT through promoting equal rights, or negative through the hate crimes that were mentioned?
Social media, in terms of the sort of impact of abuse online, is very different to that in the physical world. So what we know is that given the specific nature of the internet, so when abuse is posted online through things such as Facebook or Twitter, it's often quite permanent. So it doesn't just get removed, it stays up for a long period of time. And what that means is that many more people see it. So if you abuse somebody online, let's say someone sends me an abusive tweet, that's not just affecting me, but lots of other people see it. And that's where it has that knock-on effect in terms of other people being harmed by it.
How do you think we can support those feeling unsupported in places of work, in school, in colleges?
I think the first thing is for everyone to acknowledge it, and for us to have that awareness that, you know, people are feeling this way in those different types of institutions, whether it's in school or workplace or at university. So I think that's the first thing. And then it's a combination of these institutions having things in place. So, for example, the University of Law has inclusion champions that work to make sure that, you know, staff members within the university feel represented, and also looking at some of the disparities and why they are those disparities, and trying to then, you know, improve on that. And that's for staff, but also to help with students as well. So students feel more represented and feel more comfortable in their place of study.
Teaching about human rights, so people get to understand what the rights are as a first step, and teaching through human rights, which means creating human rights environment in the school system or in the workplace, where people feel free to speak about, have exercise their freedom of expression, and don't have to face any kind of fear from speaking against something that happened against them or against their colleagues. And the third thing is actually teaching for human rights, which is about taking action, whether to defend ourselves or to defend others. It doesn't mean something that we don't see or it doesn't happen to us. We need to kind of like learn and develop this kind of like taking action to stand for principles. We all have rights, human rights. It comes with responsibilities.